There is a quiet discomfort many people live with, but rarely name. It doesn't feel dramatic. It doesn't announce itself as a crisis. It appears instead as a low, persistent sense that something is off. You may be functioning. You may be productive. You may even be successful. And yet, beneath the surface, there is fragmentation. You think one thing, you feel another. You act in ways you later don't fully understand. You make decisions that seem rational in the moment and foreign afterward. You react more strongly than a situation deserves, or feel nothing where something should be felt. Most people interpret this as personal failure, a lack of discipline, a flaw in character, a weakness of will. But what if that interpretation is wrong? What if the problem is not that you are broken, but that you are incomplete? Modern culture teaches a very narrow idea of identity. It tells you that you are your thoughts, your intentions, your plans, your conscious decisions. In other words, it tells you that the part of you that can speak, explain itself, and give reasons is the whole story. Yet your own experience contradicts this every day. You fall in love without deciding to. You feel anger before you understand why. You repeat patterns you swore you would never repeat. You sabotage what you consciously want. You dream things you would never choose to imagine. Something in you acts independently of your awareness, and that something is not small. If it were, it would be easy to correct. A bad habit, a mistaken belief, a simple adjustment. But the deeper the disturbance goes, the more it resists control. This is why purely rational explanations often fail. You can understand why you behave a certain way and still continue behaving that way. You can see the pattern clearly and remain unable to stop it. You can know the cause and feel no real change. This creates a subtle despair not loud enough to be called suffering, but heavy enough to drain meaning. People describe it in different ways. I don't feel like myself anymore. I don't know why I keep doing this. I feel divided. I feel hollow. I feel like I'm playing a role I can't step out of. None of these statements point to a lack of intelligence. They point to a misunderstanding of what a human being actually is. Long before modern psychology tried to reduce the mind to behavior, chemistry, or cognition, one thinker insisted on something uncomfortable: that the conscious mind is not the center of the personality. Carl Jung did not arrive at this conclusion through speculation alone. He encountered it through patients who did everything right and still suffered. Through people who understood themselves intellectually yet remained trapped emotionally. Through lives that could not be explained by conscious intention alone. What he proposed was radical and remains unsettling today. You are not a single, unified self. You are a psycho-living system composed of layers, forces, and patterns that existed before your conscious awareness ever formed. The part of you that says I is not the ruler of this system. It is a participant within it. This does not mean you are powerless, but it does mean that control is not achieved by denial. Most modern suffering comes from trying to live as if the visible surface were the whole structure, as if the lighted room were the entire house, as if what you can explain were all that exists. When the unseen parts of the psyche are ignored, they do not disappear. They express themselves indirectly through symptoms, relationships, compulsions, dreams, and crises. What feels like chaos is often order you don't yet recognize. This series begins here, not with techniques or answers, but with orientation. With the recognition that the human mind is far deeper, stranger, and more structured than modern language allows. Before we can speak of healing, integration, or transformation, one assumption must be abandoned: that you already know who you are. In the next chapter, we will begin to map the psyche not as an abstract theory, but as a living architecture that explains why this fragmentation exists and why it is not a mistake. For now, it is enough to notice the disturbance. It is not asking to be fixed. It is asking to be understood. To understand why human beings feel divided, we must first locate the part of the psyche most people mistake for the whole. This part is the ego. The ego is not a flaw. It is not the enemy. and it is not something to be destroyed. It is simply the center of conscious awareness. When you say I, when you make plans, when you think about who you are, when you reflect on your past or imagine your future, you are speaking from the ego. It organizes experience. It gives continuity to life. Without it, there would be no memory, no responsibility, no direction. But problems begin the moment the ego believes it is the entirety of the psyche. Carl Jung described consciousness as a small island surrounded by a vast ocean. The island is visible, structured, and familiar. The ocean is deep, dark, and largely unknown. The mistake modern people make is assuming the island is all that exists, then wondering why waves keep crashing over its edges. The ego develops early in life. As children, we learn to distinguish ourselves from the world. We learn what is me and what is not me. We learn how to act in ways that bring approval and avoid punishment. Gradually, a center of awareness forms that can say, "This is happening to me. This process is necessary." Without it, there would be no sense of identity. But the ego's strength is also its limitation. It knows only what it can see. It understands only what it can name. It trusts only what fits into language, logic, and personal memory. Anything that does not fit into this narrow field is treated as irrelevant, irrational, or threatening. And so the ego does something very efficient and very dangerous. It simplifies. It reduces the complexity of the psyche into a manageable story. I am this kind of person. I would never do that. This is what I want. This is what I believe. These statements create stability. They also create blindness. Because life is larger than any story the ego can tell about itself. The ego cannot see the origins of many of its own impulses. It cannot explain why certain thoughts appear uninvited. It cannot account for emotional reactions that arrive fully formed. It cannot understand why patterns repeat despite conscious resistance. From the ego's perspective, these experiences feel intrusive. From the psyche's perspective, they are normal expressions of deeper processes. This is where modern misunderstanding begins. When the ego encounters something it cannot control, it often interprets it as a malfunction. Anxiety becomes a defect. Depression becomes a chemical error. Desire becomes a temptation to suppress. Fear becomes a weakness to overcome. The ego wants clarity, certainty, and mastery. It wants the psyche to behave like a machine with predictable outputs. But the psyche is not mechanical. It is symbolic. It is layered. It is alive. Jung warned that when the ego overestimates its authority, it creates an inner tension that eventually demands correction. The psyche seeks balance. When consciousness grows too narrow, the unconscious compensates. This compensation does not arrive politely. It arrives as symptoms, as obsessions, as emotional eruptions, as dreams that disturb the ego's self-image, as life events that shatter carefully constructed identities. From the ego's point of view, this feels like sabotage. From a psychological point of view, it is regulation. The ego is meant to be a mediator, not a dictator. It is meant to relate to the deeper layers of the psyche, not deny their existence. When it refuses this relationship, it becomes rigid, defensive, brittle, and brittle structures break. This is why people often feel most lost when they are most identified with who they think they are. The stronger the attachment to a fixed self-image, the more violent the disruption when life contradicts it. Understanding the ego's limits is not a humiliation. It is a relief. It means you are not failing when parts of you act independently of your conscious will. It means the psyche is larger than your current awareness and that growth requires dialogue, not domination. The ego is the beginning of consciousness, not its completion. In the next chapter, we will move just beneath the surface of awareness and explore the first hidden layer of the psyche that stores what the ego forgets, represses, or never fully acknowledges. What the ego cannot see does not vanish. It waits. Beneath the small island of conscious awareness lies the first hidden layer of the psyche. It is not distant or mysterious in the way myths are mysterious. It is intimate, personal, familiar, yet strangely inaccessible. This is what Jung called the personal unconscious. Carl Jung did not imagine this layer as a dark vault filled only with repressed horrors. That is a modern exaggeration. The personal unconscious is far more ordinary and far more influential. It is composed of everything the ego has forgotten, ignored, rejected, or never fully processed. Memories that lost their emotional charge, experiences that were too painful, too confusing, or too inconvenient to integrate. Feelings that didn't fit the image you needed to maintain. Desires that threatened attachment, safety, or belonging. Nothing here is inherently pathological. What makes this layer powerful is not what it contains, but the fact that the ego no longer recognizes it as its own. The personal unconscious is formed gradually, without intention. As children, we learn very quickly what is acceptable and what is not. Certain emotions are welcomed, others are discouraged. Some traits bring love and attention. Others bring distance or disapproval. The psyche adapts. Feelings that disrupt connection are pushed aside. Reactions that threaten survival are suppressed. Experiences that cannot be understood are stored away, not erased, but set aside. The ego tells itself a simple story. That's not me. I don't feel that. I'm not that kind of person. And so the psyche divides. What is accepted remains conscious. What is unacceptable sinks below the threshold of awareness. Over time, this creates a storehouse of disowned materials still alive, still charged, still capable of influence and behavior. This is why people often react strongly to situations that seem trivial, why certain comments strike deeper than expected, why familiar patterns repeat without conscious consent. The personal unconscious does not speak in explanations. It speaks in emotion, impulse, and association. It expresses itself through slips of the tongue, through sudden moods, through attractions and aversions that defy logic, through dreams that feel oddly specific. From the ego's perspective, these intrusions feel random. From the psyche's perspective, they are precise. Nothing stored in the personal unconscious is there by accident. What the ego refuses to hold consciously does not disappear. It simply changes its mode of expression. When acknowledged, this material can be integrated. When ignored, it becomes autonomous. Jung observed that the more rigid the ego becomes, the more active the personal unconscious grows. The psyche seeks balance. If one side is silenced, the other compensates. This compensation often takes the form of complex, emotionally charged clusters of memories and feelings that behave almost like subpersonalities. A person may say, "I don't know why I reacted like that." In truth, a complex reacted. A person may feel taken over by anger, shame, or desire. In truth, something long stored away has found a moment of expression. The personal unconscious is not hostile. It is unfinished business. It contains not only pain, but potential. Not only fear, but creativity. Not only weakness, but vitality. Many talents remain buried here because they once threatened safety. Many strengths were suppressed because they did not fit early expectations. Modern culture often encourages people to bypass this layer entirely, to reframe, reprogram, or medicate away what causes discomfort. Jung took a different approach. He believed that psychological health does not come from eliminating unconscious material, but from entering into relationship with it. The personal unconscious is the psyche's memory of what the ego could not yet bear. Ignoring it does not make a person rational. It makes them predictable. Only when the ego begins to recognize its own forgotten contents does genuine growth become possible. Yet even this layer is not the deepest source of human behavior. Beneath the personal unconscious lies something far older, something not formed by personal experience at all. In the next chapter, we move beyond what belongs only to you and into what you share with every human being who has ever lived. When people first hear the term collective unconscious, they often misunderstand it. They imagine a mystical cloud, a shared mind floating above humanity, or a poetic metaphor meant to sound profound. Carl Jung meant none of these. What he described was far more unsettling and far more concrete. Beneath the personal unconscious lies a layer of the psyche that does not come from your childhood, your culture, or your individual life at all. It is not built through experience. It is inherited. Just as the human body carries biological patterns shaped by evolution, Jung argued that the psyche carries psychological patterns shaped by the entire history of the species. You are born with a nervous system already prepared to see faces, to fear certain dangers, to seek attachment, to recognize threat, to respond to symbols long before you understand them consciously. The collective unconscious is this inherited psychic structure. It is not composed of memories. It contains no personal stories. It does not remember events. Instead, it contains forms, deep organizing patterns that shape how experience is perceived and interpreted. These patterns existed before you learned language, before you formed an ego, before you developed a personal history. This is why certain images, stories, and themes appear again and again across cultures that never met. Flood myths, hero journeys, wise elders, tricksters, monsters guarding thresholds, sacrifices, rebirths, descents into darkness. These are not copied ideas. They are expressions of the same underlying psychic architecture. The collective unconscious explains something modern psychology struggles with: why human beings across time respond emotionally to the same symbolic situations. A snake still evokes instinctive reactions. Darkness still carries psychological weight. Isolation still feels dangerous. The unknown still provokes anxiety and fascination. These responses are not learned from scratch. They are activated. The ego does not invent meaning, it encounters it. This layer of the psyche operates beneath individual choice. It shapes what feels meaningful, terrifying, sacred, or forbidden before conscious reasoning has time to intervene. And because it is unconscious, it is often mistaken for reality itself. When someone feels that an experience is fated, inevitable, or larger than life, they are often encountering material from this deep layer. The collective unconscious does not think in words. It thinks in images, patterns, and myths. This is why purely rational explanations fail to address many human behaviors. Logic can describe a fear without dissolving it. Reason can name a pattern without changing its emotional power. The psyche responds to meaning, not argument. Modern individuals often believe they are autonomous in a way no human has ever truly been. They see themselves as self-created, self-defined, and independent of the past. Jung saw this as a dangerous illusion. When the collective unconscious is ignored, it does not disappear. It expresses itself unconsciously through mass movements, ideologies, religious fervor, moral panics, and collective obsessions. What individuals repress, societies project. This is why certain historical periods seem to be possessed by ideas. Entire populations become emotionally synchronized around symbols, enemies, promises, or fears. The ego believes it is making rational choices. The psyche is responding to archetypal forces. On a personal level, this same process plays out more quietly. A person may feel drawn to certain roles, fears, or fantasies without knowing why. They may feel called toward meaning or pulled toward destruction without being able to explain the source. These are not random impulses. They are expressions of something ancient moving through a modern life. The collective unconscious does not override individuality, but it frames it. You do not choose the psychic landscape you were born into. You choose how consciously you relate to it. Ignoring this layer does not make a person modern or enlightened. It leaves them vulnerable to forces they cannot name. Understanding it does not mean surrendering to myth. It means recognizing that human consciousness rests on foundations far older than reason. Yet the collective unconscious does not reach the ego directly. It speaks through intermediary specific patterns that translate this ancient structure into lived experience. These patterns are called archetypes. In the next chapter, we will examine these archetypes not as fictional characters, but as living psychological forces that shape identity, relationships, morality, and destiny itself. They are the bridges between the ancient psyche and your personal life. When Jung spoke of archetypes, he was careful to correct a common misunderstanding. Archetypes are not images you learn. They are not characters invented by culture. They are not ideas passed down through tradition. They are forms without content patterns that shape experience long before the ego interprets it. Carl Jung compared archetypes to riverbeds. Water may change, landscapes may shift, but the channel remains. Experience flows through these structures, taking shape as it moves, yet never creating the structure itself. This is why the same psychological dramas repeat across history with different costumes. A hero does not look the same in every culture. A mother does not behave identically in every society. A tyrant does not use the same language in every era, but the pattern remains. Archetypes are not inherited images. They are inherited ways of responding. The child archetype organizes experiences of vulnerability and potential. The mother archetype organizes experiences of nourishment, protection, and engulfment. The hero archetype organizes confrontation with danger, challenge, and transformation. The trickster organizes disruption, ambiguity, and boundary breaking. These patterns awaken when life presents the right conditions. You do not decide to activate an archetype, you find yourself inside one. A person does not wake up and choose to become a rescuer. They feel compelled to fix, to save, to carry responsibility that was never formally assigned. Another does not consciously choose to become the rebel. They feel suffocated by order, driven toward transgression, energized by opposition. From the ego's perspective, these behaviors feel personal. From the psyche's perspective, they are archetypal. This is where archetypes become dangerous. When an archetype is conscious, it can be related to. When it is unconscious, it possesses. Jung used the word possession deliberately, not in a supernatural sense, but in a psychological one. A possessed person is not insane. They are identified. They no longer act from choice, but from compulsion. They do not use the archetype, it uses them. The hero becomes incapable of rest. The caregiver becomes unable to set boundaries. The judge becomes morally rigid. The trickster becomes destructive rather than playful. In each case, the ego mistakes an archetypal force for identity itself. This is why archetypes feel larger than life. They carry emotional intensity beyond the personal scale. They bring energy, meaning, and direction. They also bring blindness. Archetypes do not care about your happiness. They care about expression. When an archetype is denied expression, it does not vanish. It returns distorted. The unlived hero becomes resentment. The rejected lover becomes obsession. The suppressed warrior becomes passive aggression. The denied ruler becomes covert control. Modern people often believe they are free because they reject myths and symbols. Jung believed the opposite. Those who deny archetypes are most likely to be governed by them unconsciously. Because archetypes operate beneath rational thought, they often express themselves symbolically through dreams, fantasies, projections, and sudden shifts in behavior. A person may fall in love not with another human being, but with an archetypal image projected onto them. A leader may become dangerous, not because of ideology, but because they embody an archetype the collective is hungry for. A movement may become destructive because it unconsciously activates ancient patterns of purification, sacrifice, or enemy creation. The ego believes it is choosing, the psyche is reenacting. Archetypes are not good or evil. They are powerful. They require consciousness, containment, and relationship. This is why Jung insisted that psychological maturity is not achieved by suppressing archetypes or acting them out blindly, but by recognizing them as patterns, not identities. You are not the hero. You are not the victim. You are not the caretaker. You are not the ruler. You are a human being moving through archetypal currents. When these currents are named, They lose some of their power to overwhelm. When they remain unconscious, they shape fate. Yet archetypes alone do not explain why modern people feel uniquely fragmented. There is one more element, one that arises when these deep structures clash with a world that demands constant adaptation. In the next chapter, we will examine why modern life intensifies psychological division, and how living against the architecture of the psyche produces the very symptoms people are trying to escape. The problem is not that archetypes exist. The problem is that we live as if they do not. If the psyche has always been layered, if ego, unconscious, and archetypal forces have always existed, then a reasonable question arises. Why does fragmentation feel so widespread now? Why do so many people experience anxiety, emptiness, identity, confusion, and a sense of inner division as a normal condition of modern life? Carl Jung did not believe this was accidental. He believed modern life places the human psyche under conditions it was never designed to endure without consequence. The modern world rewards adaptation above all else. From an early age, individuals are trained to specialize, to perform, to optimize, to present a coherent, socially acceptable version of themselves across many contexts: work, family, public life, digital spaces. This constant adaptation strengthens the ego and the persona. It also weakens the relationship to the deeper layers of the psyche. The unconscious does not speak in metrics. It does not respond to productivity. It does not care about efficiency, branding, or optimization. It speaks through feeling, symbol, rhythm, and meaning. Modern life leaves very little space for these modes of expression. When the psyche cannot express itself symbolically, it expresses itself symptomatically. What appears as anxiety is often unrecognized, meaning pressing for attention. What appears as depression is often energy withdrawn from a life that no longer feels psychologically truthful. What appears as restlessness is often an unlived aspect of the personality demanding recognition. Fragmentation increases when the ego is forced to maintain a stable identity across incompatible demands. You are expected to be ambitious but calm, competitive but compassionate, authentic but marketable, unique but conforming. Each of these demands pulls the psyche in a different direction. The ego attempts to reconcile them through control and explanation. The unconscious responds through contradiction. Dreams become more vivid. Emotional reactions become less predictable. Compulsions intensify. Fatigue sets in, not physical fatigue, but existential exhaustion. This is not weakness. It is the psyche signaling imbalance. Jung observed that many of his patients were not suffering because of trauma alone, but because they were living lives too narrow for the fullness of their nature. Their conscious values no longer aligned with their unconscious needs. The psyche seeks wholeness, not comfort. When life becomes too one-sided, too rational, too moral, too productive, too controlled, the unconscious compensates by pushing in the opposite direction. Excessive order invites chaos. Excessive morality invites transgression. Excessive control invites breakdown. Modern individuals often misinterpret these compensations as personal failure. They try to suppress symptoms rather than understand their meaning. They treat signals as errors. They attempt to fix the psyche rather than listen to it. This deepens the divide. Fragmentation is not caused by having unconscious layers. It is caused by denying relationship with them. Earlier cultures, for all their limitations, provided symbolic containers for the psychorituals, myths, rites of passage, shared narratives that helped individuals situate their inner experiences within a larger context. Modern life has largely dismantled these containers without replacing them. The result is a psyche rich in content but poor in meaning. People feel overwhelmed not because they have too much inner life, but because they lack a framework to hold it. This is why individuals often turn unconsciously to substitute ideologies, fandoms, identities, addictions, or moral crusades to regain a sense of wholeness. These substitutes work temporarily. They also create new forms of possession. The psyche does not ask to be entertained. It asks to be recognized. Fragmentation persists as long as the ego insists on being the sole authority. Integration begins when the ego accepts its limits. Jung did not promise harmony. He promised orientation. To understand the psyche is not to eliminate conflict, but to place it within a meaningful structure. In this first episode, we have not yet spoken of solutions, practices, or integration. That is intentional. Before one can move forward, one must understand the terrain. In the final chapters of this episode, we will step back and look at the psyche as a whole, not as separate pieces, but as a dynamic system whose tension is not a flaw, but a feature of being human. Fragmentation is not the end of the story. It is the signal that the story has grown larger than the ego's current map. Up to this point, the psyche may appear as a set of separate layers: ego above, unconscious below, archetypes beneath that. It is tempting to imagine these as stacked compartments, clean, distinct, and orderly. Carl Jung warned against this image. The psyche is not a building. It is a system. Its parts do not exist in isolation. They interact, compensate, and respond to one another continuously. What changes in one layer alters the behavior of the whole. When consciousness becomes narrow, the unconscious grows active. When the ego becomes rigid, archetypal forces intensify. When meaning is lost at the surface, it reappears in symbolic form below. Nothing in the psyche is static. This is why psychological life cannot be understood through labels alone. You can name a part of the psyche without understanding how it behaves in motion. You can describe a function without seeing how it compensates when ignored. The psyche seeks equilibrium, not stasis. Equilibrium does not mean calm. It means balance between opposing forces, consciousness and unconsciousness, stability and change, order and chaos, adaptation and authenticity. When these opposites are held in tension, the psyche remains alive. When one side dominates, the other does not submit, it retaliates. This is the principle that underlies Jung's entire model. Modern thinking often assumes that problems can be eliminated. Jung believes psychological problems must be related to. They are expressions of imbalance, not intrusions from outside the system. A person who suppresses anger may become depressed. A person who denies vulnerability may develop anxiety. A person who over-identifies with morality may become cruel in the name of righteousness. Each symptom compensates for a one-sided attitude. The psyche is intelligent in this sense. It responds purposefully, even when its responses are painful. What appears as dysfunction often contains information the ego refuses to hear. This is why Jung insisted that symptoms should not be rushed away. They should be approached as messages, coded, symbolic, and indirect, but meaningful. To see the psyche as a system also changes how responsibility is understood. Responsibility does not mean controlling everything that arises internally. That would be impossible. It means taking consciousness of what seeks expression. The ego's task is not to dominate the psyche, but to mediate it, to listen without capitulating, to recognize without inflating, to act without denying. When the ego refuses this task, the psyche reorganizes itself without the ego's consent. This reorganization can take many forms: a sudden loss of direction, a breakdown that feels unjustified, a life event that shatters long-held plans, a dream that destabilizes a cherished self-image. From the outside, these events appear disruptive. From the inside, they often mark the beginning of reorientation. The psyche does not punish, it corrects. Understanding this shifts the question from "how do I get rid of this?" to "what balance is being restored?" This does not romanticize suffering. Jung was clear that pain is real and must be taken seriously, but he rejected the idea that psychological pain is meaningless. Meaning is not added later. It is present from the beginning. The psyche becomes destructive only when it is ignored for too long. When signals are dismissed repeatedly, the system amplifies them. Small disturbances become crises. Whispers become compulsions. Tensions become breakdowns. Seen this way, psychological health is not the absence of conflict. It is the capacity to hold conflict consciously without collapsing into identification or denial. This is why Jung's model cannot be reduced to a technique. It is an orientation toward inner life, a way of seeing human beings as dynamic, symbolic systems rather than machines to be fixed. In the chapters that follow, we will begin to integrate this perspective more fully. We will step back from the individual components and look at what this model implies for identity, responsibility, and growth. For now, it is enough to understand this. You are not fragmented because something is wrong with you. You are fragmented because the psyche is alive and life resists simplification. The task is not to silence this life, but to learn how to stand in relationship with it. In the next chapter, we will examine what happens when this relationship begins, when consciousness starts to recognize its limits and the psyche responds not with chaos, but with direction. There comes a moment, sometimes gradual, sometimes sudden, when the ego reaches the edge of its competence. This moment rarely arrives with clarity. It often appears as confusion, fatigue, or quiet disillusionment. The strategies that once worked begin to fail. The explanations that once satisfied no longer convince. Carl Jung considered this moment unavoidable in a psychologically honest life. It is the point at which consciousness encounters its limits. For much of early life, the ego grows by expansion. It learns, adapts, differentiates. It becomes more capable of navigating the external world. This growth is necessary. Without it, there is no individuality. But expansion alone cannot continue indefinitely. At a certain point, the ego reaches a threshold beyond which further growth does not bring clarity, but tension. The more tightly it tries to hold life together through willpower and explanation, the more strain it experiences internally. This is often misinterpreted as regression. People say they are losing motivation, losing direction, or losing themselves. In truth, they are losing the illusion that consciousness alone can carry the weight of the psyche. This confrontation is uncomfortable because it undermines the ego's primary belief that awareness equals control. When this belief begins to crack, the ego faces a choice. It can double down, tighten its grip, enforce stricter narratives, moralize, rationalize, suppress, or it can pause and listen. Jung observed that many neuroses emerge precisely at this crossroads. The psyche begins to demand recognition, while the ego insists on dominance. What follows is often inner conflict that feels senseless and exhausting. Yet this conflict is not arbitrary. It signals a transition. When consciousness meets its limits, the psyche does not dissolve into chaos. It reorganizes around a deeper center, one that does not belong to the ego alone. This reorganization is not immediate. It begins subtly. Dreams become more symbolic. Emotional reactions feel disproportionate but meaningful. Old questions resurface with new urgency. Values that once felt solid begin to feel hollow. The ego experiences this as destabilization, but from the perspective of the psyche, it is reorientation. Jung believed that many modern crises, especially those labeled midlife crises, are not failures of character or discipline, but signs that the psyche is shifting its center of gravity. What once mattered no longer satisfies. What was ignored begins to insist. This is why purely external solutions often fail at this stage. Changing jobs, relationships, or environments may provide temporary relief, but the underlying tension remains. The psyche is not asking for change in circumstances. It is asking for change in relationship. Specifically, a change in how the ego relates to the unconscious. When the ego acknowledges its limits without collapsing into helplessness, something new becomes possible. A dialogue begins, not in words, but in attention. Dreams are taken seriously. Emotions are treated as information rather than obstacles. Symptoms are approached as signals rather than enemies. This does not mean surrendering agency. It means expanding the field of responsibility. Responsibility shifts from control to awareness. Jung was careful to distinguish this process from mysticism or passivity. Recognizing limits does not mean abandoning reason. It means placing reason within a larger context. Consciousness becomes one function among many, rather than the sole authority. This shift is subtle, but profound. When the ego steps back from absolute dominance, the psyche often responds with direction, not certainty, but orientation. Not answers, but movement. The person may not know exactly where they are going, but they know they cannot return to where they were. This threshold where consciousness meets its limits is not a breakdown. It is the beginning of a different kind of psychological life. In the next chapter, we will begin to glimpse what lies beyond this threshold, not as an abstract ideal, but as the organizing principle Jung called the self. Understanding this principle will clarify why the psyche resists being reduced to ego alone, and why wholeness always feels larger and more demanding than comfort. When Jung spoke of the self, he was not referring to personality, identity, or self-image. He was naming something far more difficult to grasp and far more essential. Carl Jung described the self as the totality of the psyche, not a part among other parts, but the organizing principle that holds them together. This is where many misunderstandings arise. Modern language treats the self as something we construct, a narrative, a brand, a personal truth we shape and defend. Jung's self is the opposite of this idea. The self is not created. It is discovered. It is not chosen. It reveals itself, and it is not identical with consciousness. If the ego is the center of awareness, the self is the center of meaning. This distinction matters. The ego asks, "What do I want?" The self asks, "What wants to come into being through me?" The ego seeks control, coherence, and recognition. The self seeks balance, wholeness, and integration. When these two centers are confused, psychological trouble follows. If the ego believes it is the self, it becomes inflated. It assumes moral authority it does not possess. It interprets inner experiences as personal destiny. It confuses insight with superiority. Jung called this ego inflation, and he considered it one of the most dangerous psychological states, especially among intelligent, idealistic, or spiritually inclined people. Inflation does not announce itself as arrogance. It often appears as certainty, as righteousness, as the feeling of being chosen to see what others cannot. At the other extreme lies ego collapse. Here, the ego loses its sense of direction entirely. It becomes overwhelmed by unconscious material. Emotions flood consciousness without structure. Meaning dissolves into chaos. Both inflation and collapse result from the same mistake: misunderstanding the relationship between ego and self. The ego is meant to relate to the self, not replace it. This relationship is not symmetrical. The ego does not command the self. The self does not eliminate the ego. They exist in tension. Jung described this relationship as the ego's self-axis, line of communication between conscious awareness and the deeper organizing center of the psyche. When this axis is weak, life feels meaningless or chaotic. When it is distorted, life feels grandiose or absolute. When it is healthy, life feels demanding but oriented. The self does not promise happiness. It demands truth. It demands that neglected aspects of the psyche be acknowledged, that one-sided identities be relinquished, that unconscious conflicts be faced rather than bypassed. This is why encounters with the self often feel numinous charged with emotion, significance, and a sense of inevitability. They may appear in dreams as wise figures, mandalas, divine images, or moments of profound insight. But Jung warned against taking these symbols literally. The self does not want worship, it wants relationship. To confuse the symbol with the reality is to fall back into inflation. The self organizes the psyche toward wholeness, but it does not eliminate contradiction. Wholeness includes tension. Integration includes conflict. This is why growth often feels like loss. What the ego cherished must sometimes be surrendered. What was denied must be faced. What was avoided must be lived consciously. The self does not negotiate around comfort, it reorganizes around necessity. Modern culture often encourages people to strengthen the ego endlessly to optimize identity, sharpen performance, and secure status. Jung saw this as incomplete development. Without a relationship to the self, the ego becomes brittle. Without ego strength, the self cannot be realized consciously. The task is balance. To live psychologically is to stand between these two centers, aware of the ego's limits, attentive to the self's demands, and willing to bear the tension between them. This tension is not a problem to solve. It is the condition of becoming whole. In the next chapter, we will begin to draw the threads of this model together. We will look at how ego, unconscious, archetypes, and self form a coherent structure, and why understanding this structure changes how one relates to inner conflict, meaning, and responsibility itself. At this point, the structure of Jung's model begins to reveal its true character. The psyche is not a hierarchy with the ego at the top, nor is it a battlefield where one part must defeat another. It is a field of tensions, and life emerges from how these tensions are held. Carl Jung believed that psychological vitality depends on the ability to tolerate opposites without forcing a premature resolution. This idea runs against modern habits of mind. We are trained to eliminate contradiction, to simplify complexity, to choose sides, to resolve discomfort as quickly as possible. The psyche resists this. When opposites are forced apart, energy is lost. When one pole dominates, the other becomes destructive. Meaning arises not from purity, but from containment. The ego wants certainty, the unconscious offers ambiguity, the self demands wholeness. When the ego insists on clarity at all costs, it flattens experience. When the unconscious overwhelms consciousness, coherence dissolves. When the self is mistaken for ego identity, inflation follows. Psychological health lies not in avoiding these forces, but in holding their tension consciously. Jung called this the transcendent function, not because it lifts a person above life, but because it allows something new to emerge between opposites. This something new cannot be forced. It emerges when the ego listens without capitulating, the unconscious is acknowledged without being literalized. Symbols are taken seriously, but not concretely. This is why Jung placed such emphasis on symbols, dreams, and imagination. They allow the psyche to express tension without collapsing it into action or repression. A dream does not tell you what to do. It shows you what is alive. When the ego learns to stay present with contradiction, desire, and restraint, fear and courage, order and chaos, the psyche no longer needs to compensate violently. Energy that was trapped in conflict becomes available for life. This is not a comfortable process. Holding tension means resisting the urge to escape through certainty, ideology, or moral superiority. It means allowing ambiguity to remain unresolved long enough for insight to mature. Most people abandon this process too early. They reach for answers instead of orientation. They choose roles instead of relationships. They cling to identities instead of bearing uncertainty. The psyche responds by narrowing, but when tension is held, when the ego accepts that it is not the sole authority, and the unconscious is allowed symbolic expression, the psyche begins to self-organize. This is not mysticism. It is psychological dynamics. Just as a physical system seeks equilibrium, the psyche seeks balance between opposing tendencies. But equilibrium here does not mean stillness. It means dynamic stability, movement within form. This is why Jung rejected both rigid rationalism and uncontrolled emotionalism. Both represent collapse into one pole of experience. The psyche requires a container. For Jung, that container was consciousness, capable of reflection, humility, and responsibility. Responsibility here does not mean blame. It means responsibility, the capacity to respond rather than react. When the ego can respond, the psyche does not need to erupt. This is why integration is never a single event. It is a practice of attention, to notice when one-sidedness appears, to recognize when projections intensify, to listen when symptoms speak, to question when certainty hardens. Holding tension is not dramatic, it is quiet, often invisible, but it is the condition under which psychological life remains creative rather than destructive. In the final chapter of this episode, we will step back once more and consider what this model asks of a human being, not in theory, but in life. Understanding the psyche is not an end, it is a responsibility at the end of this first exploration. It is important to be clear about what Jung's model of the psyche does and does not offer. It does not give instructions for how to live. It does not promise certainty. It does not eliminate conflict. Carl Jung was deeply skeptical of systems that claimed to deliver psychological peace through formulas. He believed such promises misunderstood the nature of the human mind. The psyche is not something to be solved. It is something to be related to. Jung's model provides orientation, not answers. Orientation means knowing where you stand in relation to forces larger than the ego. It means understanding that inner conflict is not necessarily pathology, that contradiction does not imply failure, and that suffering often carries information rather than error. When a person understands the psyche is layered and dynamic, certain assumptions quietly dissolve. You stop asking why you are not consistent. You stop demanding permanent clarity. You stop interpreting every inner disturbance as a problem to eliminate. Instead, you begin to ask different questions. What part of the psyche is speaking here? What has been ignored that now insists on attention? Where has life become too narrow for what wants to emerge? These questions do not produce immediate relief. They produce depth. Depth slows things down. It replaces urgency with patience. It transforms reaction into reflection. This is why Jung emphasized that psychological maturity is rare and demanding. It requires the courage to stay present with ambiguity without fleeing into simplifications, whether those simplifications are scientific, moral, spiritual, or ideological. The ego naturally wants closure. The psyche moves in cycles. Understanding this prevents a common mistake, trying to use psychology as a tool for self-optimization. Jung did not see the goal of life as becoming efficient, successful, or even happy. He saw it as becoming whole, and wholeness includes contradiction, limitation, and uncertainty. This is not comforting. It is grounding. When people feel fragmented, they often search for unity through external means, belief systems, identities, movements, or roles that promise coherence. These structures can stabilize temporarily, but they do so by narrowing the psyche rather than integrating it. Jung's model offers a different path. It asks the ego to relinquish absolute authority without collapsing into passivity. It asks the unconscious to be heard without being acted out blindly. It asks the self to be acknowledged without being inflated into identity. This balance is never final. Life will disrupt it again and again. New tensions will arise. Old patterns will resurface in new forms. But with orientation, these disruptions no longer feel meaningless. They become signals. They point toward imbalance. They invite renewed relationship. This is why Jung insisted that consciousness is not meant to abolish the unconscious, but to widen enough to include it. To live psychologically is not to be free of inner conflict. It is to be responsible for it. Responsibility here does not mean control. It means awareness, humility, and response. The psyche will always be larger than what the ego can grasp, but it does not demand mastery. It demands attention. As this series continues, we will move deeper into specific structures within this model, into the ego's fear of wholeness, the masks we wear to survive, the shadow that refuses erasure, and the inner figures that shape love, power, and meaning. Everything that follows rests on this foundation. You are not fragmented because you are broken. You are fragmented because you are complex. Jung's work does not remove this complexity. It teaches you how to stand inside it without losing yourself. That is not an answer. it is an orientation. And for a human being navigating an inner world far older than consciousness itself, orientation is often enough to begin